Hello and welcome to the webinar on grading technology audits from Sun Associates. Glad to see folks here this afternoon, and as soon as we're done with some logistical issues around the recording and such, we'll be ready to go. And here we go, just a second. Interaction. Who we are. My name is Jeff Sun, and I'm with Sun Associates, and also here with me is Gene Clark. Say hi.
Hello, everybody.
And Gene and I, some of you might have met before, actually, but we do this work on a day-to-day basis, is auditing and evaluation. So we're here to share that information with you. All right, so moving right along, what is an audit? So let's kind of establish that as a basis here. An audit, in its most simplest perspective, is a review of a program or initiative. And we're going to talk about auditing and evaluation here within the context of digital learning initiatives and digital learning plans. Basically, the procedures that we talk about here today would be applicable to any number of different programs. And we will use various examples that look at large initiatives and also small individual projects. So hopefully we'll be able to give you a sense as to how the auditing and evaluation framework we talk about can apply to a lot of different things. Naturally, there's a question that I think should get established toward the very beginning of why would somebody want to audit? And the position that we put forward about this is that you would audit to assess your initiative or your program's progress against goals, standards, and expected outcomes. And we think that we'll also be able to show as we go through here that the auditing and evaluation process is a really good one for establishing those expected outcomes and clarifying your goals and looking at how these things connect to standards. Of course, there's some other reasons why you'd want to do this, and one of the ones that we encounter all the time in our work is that an audit or an evaluation is frequently used to validate funding decisions. So particularly in the case of a digital learning plan at a district level, where there might be a lot of funding actually put in by the school or the district into populating and developing that plan. And audit or evaluation, or audit in that case usually, is something that is very valuable for helping a district understand the ongoing value of committing funding to the digital learning plan. And also in the case of a large initiative, but as well small initiatives, we think that the auditing and the evaluation is good for being able to develop priorities for moving ahead. And that would be helping you understand what's working in your initiative and what you need to do to improve your work as you move forward. Okay. In one of the resources that you'll be able to access in the additional resources is some material on other reasons why you would want to conduct an audit, and that's actually been developed by somebody who those of you in Massachusetts may know. Jean Tower posted this on her blog, and we think that's a great set of resources or explanations as to why you'd want to go about doing this work. So to kind of sum that up, the overall point of why you'd want to do an audit or an evaluation is to grapple with an understanding of the pieces of your program work and to understand why they're working. Okay. And to this end, I think that we would probably also want to point out here that a lot of the evaluation work that we'll be talking about here today and the evaluation work that we've done with various districts is formative as well as summative. And I think a lot of people tend to think of evaluation primarily as being a summative process, and that is, we did this thing and how did it turn out? And of course, you're able to get that out of this work as well. But there's much to be learned formatively as you go along. So that's another big piece of doing this kind of work. And it's really the why things are working aspect that we think is particularly important. And all of that, why it's working, is an explanation that's developed within the context of understanding what it is that you want to do and what it is that you want to accomplish. And a big aspect of this work is helping to identify or grapple with how you measure progress toward the goals and the objectives and the outcomes that you'd like to have. So with that in mind, that is talking about measuring progress, we know that this is something that a lot of you probably are particularly interested in already. And we thought we'd do a quick poll here just to sort of get things moving and get your input. We're going to flash a poll up here in a second, but the poll will be about measuring progress. And we'd like to get a handle on how do you currently measure progress in your technology program or digital learning program. So I'm going to switch the screen here now to a survey. And hopefully you see a survey up on your screen at this point. And if you can, yes, just sort of click in there. And if you have other things that you don't see in this list, you can type them into the chat window and let other people see what they've got there. So I can see a lot of you are doing surveys, observations, focus groups. Be particularly interested in hearing a little bit more as we go on about the analysis of student test scores. And some of the other things. See, somebody was trying to type something into the chat window there in a second. Okay. So it looks like a lot of people are doing a variety of the things that, Gene, I think we see this stuff pretty traditionally. Certainly a lot of work with surveys. It looks like the majority of you are saying that you currently do surveys, classroom observations. That's great. Okay. And I see somebody saying that they use pieces of the ITIL continuous improvement process. That's great. Also, in the resources that are available to go along with this are a variety of existing frameworks and measurements, and I'm not 100% familiar with that particular one, the ITL continuous improvement process, but there are things like OT, ISTE has a survey tool or a evaluation framework now, so there's a variety of those kinds of things that are out there. Let me end the voting and people can see what it is that has been done. Okay, hopefully what that did is it should be putting up on your screen the summary of survey responses so you can see what other people have done. So you'll see what it is I was just basically telling you. Okay. So this is more or less as we expected in terms of the kinds of things that people are doing to measure progress. And it's good that folks are out there measuring progress. What we want to do is to put the measurement of progress or the collection of data into context. And I think that that is sort of our main point as we move along here right now. So as you can see on the slide that should be on your screen right now, when we talk about auditing or evaluation, we're really talking about a three-step process. And you can see those 3 steps on the screen in front of you right now. The point that I wanted to make is that data collection, which is a lot of what you were responding to in that poll, is really the center part of a 3-step process. So let's take a step back and take a look at what the work is that surrounds data collection and put data collection itself into context. Okay, so the first step in doing that is to talk about the development of indicators. Okay, so you can see that the image on your screen is focusing on indicators right now. So this begs the question of what is an indicator within the context of talking about evaluation and auditing. And roughly that's a good definition of indicator, and there's resources that you can access on our resource list that talk more about development of indicators and what constitutes an indicator or what constitutes indicators, and we have sample indicators and so on and so forth available as well. But an indicator basically describes what it looks like when you achieve your goal. That is when your digital learning project or district plan is successful. Okay, so the point that you're going to hear us make time and time again here as we talk about indicators is that indicators ultimately frame your data collection. So they basically delineate the evidence and the things that you would be looking for when you do actually go out and collect data. They define what it is that you're trying to evaluate. So some of the kinds of evidence that would be delineated or described in indicators would be things that students would do, their work, their outcomes, things that teachers would do, descriptions of pedagogy, and also teacher actions and activities that are supportive of the kinds of outcomes that you wish to have in your project. So things that would describe the professional development. And also, of course, a big part of this is infrastructure and technology. Those also be things that could be described in an indicator statement. So I realize that that's probably a little abstract right now. So we're going to drill down into a couple of examples, and we'll work both of these examples for you so that you can get a better sense as to what the indicators are and how they fit into work like this. The first example that we're going to talk about is a school pilot project, and I guess we'll refer to this as being a relatively small thing to evaluate, but we'll be describing a second and third grade math project that is built around iPads as being the primary piece of technology. But I think that the key point here is that this is something that would take place just in a couple of classrooms. So we're not talking about a district-wide evaluation or audit at this point. We're talking about just a small one-off project, the kinds of things that a lot of people do as a pilot project. And the other example that will also work is a district-wide audit of a digital learning plan. And this may be the thing that many of you have come to this webinar to hear more about, but this is your classic district technology audit. So this would look very broadly at how your technology plan is working. Is your technology plan working to do the kinds of things that you want it to do? And to a large extent, is technology supporting 21st century learning, which is the primary objective for most digital learning plans nowadays in districts. So we're going to work both of those examples. Just to describe it a little bit more, the pilot project example is an example of using iPads to support a particular learning objective. And the goal of that project is what you should see on your screen right now. And I think that as we work with districts and hear about what's going on, this is a pretty classic goal for the small-scale technology pilot project. Okay, so in this particular case, students are using iPads to manipulate three-dimensional shapes and improve their basic understanding of the second and third grade math curriculum that relates to geometry. Okay. So with that, and here I can back up just a second, let you look at that for just a little bit more. With that as your project goal, what would be some of the kinds of things that you might look for? Just thinking about, if you were doing this in your district, and maybe you've done something like this already, but what are the kinds of things that you might look for as indicators for a project goal like what was just on the previous slide? And if you could kind of put some of these things up on the chat function, that'd be great. Okay, and hopefully all of you are able to see what's coming up on chat as well. But we're seeing something about student engagement, test scores. Yep, those would be things I would expect. Now, class observation or classroom observations of students using the iPad, that's data collection. And I think that the pushback that we would have with this would be, what is it that you would expect to observe through those observations? And it may well be some of the things that other people are typing. Student engagement, seeing students being able to identify those shapes. Okay. Terrific. Those are all good things.
Oh, great, good point about teacher engagement.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that, well, and I should mention here, as with all of the aspects or all of the steps in this evaluation and audit process, there is a lot of work involved in designing indicators and designing data collection tools, and even actually in thinking about the frameworks for analysis of your work. We intend to offer follow-up webinars that will drill down on those individual pieces. And this is really intended to be an overview to give people a good taste of what this work is all about, just in terms of the overall framework for it. And some of you, that may be enough and you'll get the resources and you're good to go. Some of you may want to spend more time actually thinking about or doing the real work of developing indicators and data collection tools and whatnot. And we will offer follow-up for that kind of thing. All right, so just to continue to work the example and to show you the kinds of things that would constitute indicators, and I think that these are very much the things that you identified. Up on your screen right now are 4 indicator statements from this actual project. So one of them was, as you can see, students explore and engage actively, and I think that ties in with some of the things that you guys suggested, with math concepts through the manipulation of geographic or geometric models. Students have ready access to the required hardware and software to interact with the project's content. And I didn't see that so much in the list of things that you came up with, but one of the points that I would want to make about that is that your indicators are intended to be comprehensive of all of the things that are necessary in order to be successful or to create success for your goal or your initiative. So you may not have one statement that sums everything up, but you'll want to look at multiple components of what's necessary to be successful. So in this example, we talked about the student engagement, and now we talked about the hardware and software, and that is, do they have access to the technology to do this? And just like that, we also have teacher professional development. That's a component of this, and I think somebody mentioned that in the chat a second ago. Okay. And student assessments. Now this gets to the test scores or the unit assessments or what have you, that show that they've mastered the math concepts. And I think that in real life, if this were your project, you'd spend a lot of time hashing through these things and deciding, are these the 4 things that we want, or do we want more things than this, or how do we weigh these things as far as being more or less important than each other? And that discussion is obviously very important to the overall value of doing an evaluation like this. But you would look at a number of different aspects or components. Okay. So overall, and I think that the way to sum this up is to say that your indicators describe what you see when your goal is being met. And think back to that statement about what the goal for the project was. If you were meeting that goal, you would see all of these things that are on the screen right now, and the kinds of things that you mentioned.
And also just thinking back to one of the reasons for evaluating. One of the reasons is to know how you're doing, but also to know why and which aspects are working well, so that if you cover the range of indicators like you've suggested and that we have on the screen now, talking about students, teachers, professional development, infrastructure, you're going to get the understanding of why your test scores have gone up or haven't gone up, or which elements are functioning well and which ones aren't.
Good point. So to sum that up, just to go to what an indicator actually is, because they focus on evidence. The indicators would provide descriptions of things that you would see students and teachers do, count perhaps as occurrences or access to devices, and some of that may also be the incidence of use and frequency of use that a student might have of the various technologies. Things that you would hear students, teachers, and we even threw in parents in this case. Once again, some of the kinds of data, nobody suggested this one, but some of the data that's collected in projects like this are things about what parents say about what their students are doing and how particularly if you're dealing with younger children, the impact that the parents see this activity having on their child's learning or interest or what have you. Okay. And the last one is things that you would assess as evidence of student learning. So to pull it all back together, the indicators describe what those things are. Okay. Now, this same thing works in an evaluation or an audit of a digital learning plan. It just, as people often say about this kind of thing, it's the basic process is the same, but the scale of the effort is different. So if you were dealing with something that was occurring just in 2 classrooms, then the amount of data that you collect would be naturally smaller than the amount of data that you would collect if you were looking at a full-scale district-wide technology audit. But the basic process would be the same. So I can talk a little bit about that right now. I think that many of you have created or participated in the creation of a digital learning plan in your district. And what you see on your screen right now is intended to represent sort of very broadly or schematically the framework for such a plan. They're all driven by vision, and often there are goals that relate to a number of different areas, and we have 4 different areas that you can see on the screen right now. You may have different ones, different areas, different ways to group things, but basically this is traditional. Now, we're going to take a particular look, just in the example of doing an assessment related to student skills, or student skills goals. And in fact, this is the sample student skill goal that we'll be looking at. Once again, if this were a real district audit of a real district digital learning plan, you would have probably several goals related to the subjects in each one of those 4 orange boxes. Okay, and those of you who are following along here will realize that we're going to talk in a second about, okay, so what would an indicator be for that goal? And you would have to have indicators for each one of the goals. So one of the things that I often work with when I work with districts around creating digital learning plans is think carefully about the number of goals that you create in your plan, because in fact, actually, if you have 45 different goals, then you're probably going to wind up with 45 different indicators if you follow this process, and that would soon become an unmanageable task. So there's a backwards design element of this as well, which is, think about what your indicators should be and how many indicators you're going to ultimately want to work with, and work backwards from that to inform the number of goals that you create. Okay. So in our example, what evidence would you look at? So we'll do the same thing we did just a second ago to indicate students are developing 21st century learning skills. And once again, this is the goal that you would be writing your indicator for. So let's see some stuff put up on the chat about this right now. I can see people are typing. Okay, that's a good comment coming through. The goal statement is very broad. How often will they use tech? What specific skills? We often do find that at this level, the goal statement is very broad. And that's a good question because your indicator will allow you to answer that and to narrow in on it. Okay, so as a goal, you would probably want to say that students are developing 21st century skills, but your indicator is going to allow you to define what those skills are that you're actually then proceeding to look at. And that's a good connection, I think, to make there, because sometimes people wonder sort of, well, what's the point of developing these indicators? Maybe you're not even necessarily setting out to do an audit or an evaluation. So, do we need to bother developing indicators? And yes, developing indicators will help you hone in on what your goals actually mean. Okay. So I see, yep, some of the things students can describe multiple methods to perform online research. That often turns out to be the digital literacy, information literacy connection, and we definitely consider that to be a 21st century skill.
We're seeing some 4 C's here.
Mm-hmm.
Communication, collaboration, using technology. Great.
Terrific.
Transfer of knowledge via creation. Okay, so creativity. Great.
Mm-hmm. So you're thinking this, along the lines of what we would be thinking. So we actually, the kinds of things that we traditionally see in an indicator statement that would be supportive of a student learning goal or student skills goal, like what we just saw, it will call out the fact that students are developing, are demonstrating. I think demonstrating is probably a good way to put it. The 4 C's: collaboration, critical thinking, creativity, communication. Okay. Information literacy is often a big part of that one. And of course, increasingly, thank goodness, we're seeing actual statements that are made toward or about problem solving and inquiry. And that is that students are developing skills in that, they are working in those kinds of ways. Okay. Here's where I point out that if in the resources that are attached to this webinar, there are actual indicator statements that we provided as samples that might be able to help get you started in terms of developing your own indicators for your own goals. We didn't want to put one up on the screen right now because they tend to be rather large, gnarly kind of paragraphs, and they don't transmit so well in this kind of format. But we have those actual statements that you can use as a basis for your own work or samples or what have you as resources for this webinar. And in the sample that connects back to student skills, you'll see all of these things that are on the slide now referenced in there. Okay. Of course, as we pointed out earlier, there are indicators that would be attached to goals in each one of these areas. Okay, so while for example, that there would need to be teacher professional development happening in order to be able to support the kinds of things that we just talked about in an indicator for student skills, the teacher professional development indicators statements would actually be attached probably to goals that you created for teacher professional development, teacher skills. Okay. Likewise, district supports, things such as does the district have the right policies in place, funding in place, professional development incentives, so on and so forth, to support student and teacher use of technology. Those kinds of things would be described in indicators that relate to district supports and goals. And of course, the one that often people come to the table looking for is about technology infrastructure. So, for a digital learning plan, technology infrastructure is obviously going to be a key part of that. So there you would write your indicators that relate to the capacity of the technology, both in terms of quantity, bandwidth, age of materials, software, licensing, all of that other kind of stuff that is part of the technology infrastructure that, once again, supports the achievement of the goals in the other areas. Okay, and we have examples for all of these things existing on our site. So before we move on from talking about indicators, just give you a second here to see if there are any questions that you have specifically about what's an indicator, something about the indicator creation process. And if you've got those questions, if you can put them in the chat, we'll see what we can do as far as answering them now. I think one of the things that we often hear from districts when we're talking about this kind of work is, so how do you go about creating an indicator? And, is this something that we're just going to start with a blank piece of paper and our goals and write it from scratch? Or, is there some other way to do it? And once again, we'll do a more in-depth follow-up webinar on the creation of indicators. But I think that the quick answer to that question is that, yes and yes. Some people, or some districts, do choose, whether it's at the level of a small project or a district-wide audit, to sit down with their goal or goals for their work and say, all right, so what would it look like if we've in fact actually been able to achieve and to meet this goal? And they start to sketch that out, and that's their indicator. Other people, and in fact it usually happens in the same meeting, somebody stands up and says, well, why should we be reinventing this wheel? Has somebody else not already gone out of this work before? And, frankly, yes, often somebody has done something very similar to this before, and that's the reason for looking at the samples that we have in the resources here, because we can show you what other people have done for indicators that tie back to the various components of a digital learning plan or a traditional student technology project. We do think that a key part of this work, though, is not just to sort of take somebody else's indicators and say, all right, so that's what it is that we're going to be looking for in our data collection, but rather to spend some time then reflecting on what the indicators are and how they tie back to what it is that you really want to accomplish in your project. And it may be that there's a 90% overlap. It may be that there's a 25% overlap, and only 25% of what's in the sample actually applies to what it is that you want to do. The point, though, is that you have the discussion, or if it's just one person who's doing this work, then you think about what that overlap actually is. So reflection can be something that happens with a lot of people, or it can happen with just a few people, but the point is that there be some reflection on what it is that you want to achieve. And that's the real process for creating these indicators. All right, so to move on then to the next step, once you've created your indicators, now it's time to do the thing that we talked about at the very beginning, which is data collection. So data collection is guided by your indicators. And, as I said at the very beginning, this is something that you'll hear me say time and time again. To put it in probably a more colloquial or conventional way, it makes no sense to charge out and use somebody else's framework or somebody else's survey, or you can go onto our website and find sample teacher focus group questions. But why would you use those things unless you knew what it is that you were trying to collect the data for? And that would be your indicators. Okay, so if you've got your indicators, then they can drive and guide your data collection and help you make a decision about what it is that you want to look for. So the indicators actually provide the words that you're looking for when you're out there designing your survey or using a survey or conducting your interviews, your focus groups, or what have you. Okay. So for example, if you say that you are looking for evidence of inquiry and critical thinking, okay, well, that would give you some guidance as to what sorts of questions to ask teachers, for example, in a focus group or an interview, what sorts of activities to look for in a classroom. It once again guides your data collection. So another way to put that up in a diagram is the box on the left talks about the words and the ideas, for example, that might be in your indicators. So if you're, you know, these are some of the kinds of things that we've talked about here already that you might be looking for: critical thinking or problem solving skills, technology access, so on and so forth. Okay, and then the things on the right are data collection that you would do that would be supportive of finding out about the stuff in the left. All right. So you might ask questions, and this, by the way, is at the level of talking about instruments, not actual writing of questions yet. And we will do a follow-up webinar on creating specific questions that map to your indicators. But at this point, since none of you actually have indicators for anything, you're just sort of learning about the concept, then talking about specifically what questions would you ask would be relatively abstract as well. So we're just dealing with that you want to have questions in your various data collection instruments about patterns of use. You want to be able to observe students being engaged in technology use. And you may actually, just skipping down here to the bottom, want to be able to collect some data on student achievement and outcomes. Okay. Some general tips around data collection is, and if you go back to what I think Gene was talking about this back a while ago, that one of the key aspects or the key features of doing an evaluation or an audit like this is in getting an answer or to be able to develop a case for why things are working, not just what actually is working. Okay, so to help you understand how your processes are working. That is one of the things that drives qualitative as well as quantitative data. And I think that that's something that's important to emphasize when thinking about data collection. And this starts to get down the road of how do you design these instruments and so on and so forth. But I think at this level, it suffices to say that you do ultimately, in any good evaluation or audit, want to be looking at qualitative as well as quantitative data, because the qualitative data really helps to describe why various things are happening. Okay, and another feature of a good data collection effort is that you're collecting multiple sources of data. And this goes back to some of the things that you talked about early on when you were talking about measuring progress. The fact is that you want to survey, observe, interview, focus group. You want to do all of these things. Once again, if your project is small, then if it's very small, you may not do all of these things. You may just do a few of them, but the actual number of instances that you, or cases that you observe, or people that you survey, so on and so forth, would be small compared to a district-wide audit where they would be very large. But that really is a difference in terms of scale, not in terms of function. Okay, so a good data collection effort includes all of these things. We have samples for surveys, observation protocols, focus group questions, and so on and so forth on our website. I think that some people would find that useful. I mean, it's useful to look at and to think about how those things may mesh up with indicators that you might be developing for your own projects or your own digital learning plans. We tend to tell people that you can use whatever it is that you'd like, but you will probably be wanting to modify this stuff as you start to get a better understanding of what your indicators are. Questions about data collection? There usually are quite a few things that people want to know about data collection. So if you've got some data collection questions there, you can type them into the window. Hmm. Good question about control group. And I will say that is a question that I actually respond to fairly often now, because I think people in districts and schools and just in the education field in general have been sensitized to this whole notion of randomized control trials and quasi-experimental design and those kinds of things. Bottom line is that all of those things, your experimental design and needing to contrast improvement to a control group, that applies if it's part of your indicator. So, for example, if your indicator says that students who participate in this pilot project related to using iPads to support geometry learning score 25% better than students who did not use the iPads and the software, well then, yeah, I mean, you would need to develop some sort of control group in order to be able to make that claim, okay? And if you are working under a federal grant or an NSF grant or something like that to do your work, and they specified that you needed to show X percentage increase for the students or participants, however, that participated in that project, then yes, you would need to set that kind of thing up, okay? On the other hand, if you are doing a evaluation or an audit of your digital learning plan in your district, I don't know that you necessarily would want to have indicators that say that because students use the technology, they have, they score 100 points better on, the SATs, or that MCAS scores, if you're in Massachusetts, are X percentage higher or something like that. And that gets at, I think, one of the issues around the designing of indicators again, which is that when you are designing your indicators, you are setting the terms for what constitutes success for your initiative or your project, okay? That's not always the case, because sometimes, like I said, if you're working under a funded project that we work all the time with NSF and U.S. Department of Ed and sometimes state projects, you've already been given your indicators, okay? Or at least some of the things that need to be part of your indicators. But if that's not the case, and you're simply trying to describe what it looks like when your project is successful, then you can decide whether you want to have those sorts of comparative things built in. And I think that there's a lively debate in the education field as to whether those sorts of comparative things actually are what we ought to be shooting for. But that's up to you. That's part of the definition. So good question. Any other questions about data collection? All right, so let's move on. Oh, one more is coming in. How do you measure student engagement? You measure in a variety of different ways. And once again, I think this goes back to what constitutes student engagement. There are, this is a little similar to a question that I've seen other times, which is how do you measure creativity? When we talked about our indicator saying that students would be achieving the 4 C's, while creativity is one of them. There actually are instruments and tools out there that you can find that are standardized tools for measuring creativity. Likewise, there are scales and tools out there, and we actually have some of them that are connected to the resources for this webinar, so you should be able to find the URLs for them on our site, that are about student engagement, and there are measures of student engagement. I think, so the easy answer is there are surveys and there are tools out there for that. I think that the better answer and the more complicated one is how do you define student engagement? And your definition should be something that is incorporated into your indicator, okay? So that definition may be built around the kinds of things that students do, and you need to think about what it is that you expect to see students do. Things that, and somebody added in here, particularly at the lower grade levels. All right. So there are things that you might expect students to say if they're engaged. There may be things about that you would expect teachers to say about the amount of time that students spend on a task, the amount of distractibility or lack thereof. Certainly there are more traditional measures such as, do students seem to actually get the content and understand and master the content, whatever mastery happens to mean according to your curriculum frameworks at that particular grade level or for that part of the curriculum. And those are things that, the teacher may have existing assessments for and certainly be able to comment on. Also parents can talk a lot about the degree to which their kids are engaged in activities. And that particularly works at the lower level because by the time kids get to the upper levels, parents generally don't have a clue as to what it is that they're doing. At least that seems to be my case. So a variety of different ways, and I'll just sort of wrap that all up together by saying this is another good case for something that we referred to on a previous slide about, or actually maybe it's on an upcoming slide, about looking at multiple data sources and triangulating on an answer. So student engagement very quickly could be defined through a variety of different means. You're not going to just be able to get it from one place. So there may be things that, pieces of data that would add towards your definition of engagement that would come from a survey. There may be other things that would come from focus group. There may be many things that come from classroom observation. And you would need to collect data on, in that case, all three of those axes or dimensions, and pull it together to assess your overall progress toward engagement. And that's why this work is not as simple as creating a survey, which I know that none of you feel that it is that simple, but there is, the need to collect a variety of data and also think about what your definition is.
Exactly. Yeah. There's a thing that seems to happen all the time here when we do this work, and that is to really unpack what the terms mean. So what does student engagement mean, and what does creativity mean? Well, taking the time to talk with one another in your teams or whoever is involved with the project to think about, well, what would students be able to say or do, or what would teachers say or do that would indicate that students are engaged. And it's really sort of drilling down deeper and deeper into taking away the buzzwords to really sort of, okay, if we operationalize that word, what does it look like? What do people say about it? And getting down to that granular level, then you really know how to ask the questions, you know what to look for once you go into the classrooms to do your observations, and to really be able to focus what you're looking for.
Yep. And I think that, I always try to sort of put myself in the place of a person or a district or a group or whatever who hasn't done this work before, because we do this work all the time. So a lot of this kind of comes as second nature to us, but it's not second nature to everybody. So that's why we emphasize overall the fact that there are 3 steps to this process. There's a framework for doing this work, and I think that if you break down the work into its various component pieces, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's less to do, but you can start to see how things fit together, and that place where you need to define what it is that you're looking for and what, as Jean puts it, the granularity of the terms, I think is a critical piece that's part of the indicator development process, that we find lots of times that sort of gets dropped by the wayside when people are keen to get to that middle piece, which is, let's
just want to write the survey.
Right. I want to write the survey. I want to have a survey that says this is what I'm going to look for, and boom, go with it. But there's a step that predates that. And then, of course, once you've got your data, then you're at the last stage of the process, which is analysis. So we can move on to that. Analysis It seems very simple to do because the point of it is that you're basically comparing your data back to your indicators. But in fact, actually, this is one of the more complex parts of the work. I would say as complex as developing the indicators, because you aren't going to have yes, no, black and white answers in most cases. Okay, we find that virtually no project is not successful or successful. Okay, they are not successful to some extent, and they are successful to some extent. So being able to grapple with what those extents are and describe it, that is a product of reflecting on what your data says. Okay, so all of that stuff that we just talked about using student engagement as an example, coming at it from multiple directions. You need to look at those multiple directions and say, okay, well, in sum, this is where we think we stand in terms of supporting student engagement, and this is why. Because we've got this data that shows this data that shows that, and that's how it stacks up next to our definition. So that's a reflective process. And of course, another part of this last step is reporting. And that is, considering what it is that you're going to do with all of this stuff once you've actually analyzed your data and said, okay, so this is how our project's doing. If it's a project and maybe it's just one person who's been doing this work, then your reporting is probably pretty straightforward and simple. It either just becomes a statement that you can make or a short document that you might create. On the other hand, if you're doing an audit of a district-wide digital learning plan, then your reporting is going to be much more substantive in terms of presentation, in terms of who it's presented to, in terms of what kind of report is written. And this is where we also often find, and you remember this back as one of the measuring progress steps in the poll in the beginning, often people have public meetings, discussion groups, and various ways to reflect on the findings from their evaluation with their larger district and their larger community, which once again helps achieve some of those very original basic purposes for doing the audit or the evaluation to begin with. Okay, because once again, if you have a project which is funded by the state, and they just basically need a report that says that you spent your money appropriately and you touched the number of students that you said you were going to touch, or you bought the things that you said you were going to buy. Well, that's pretty straightforward. Okay, all of those things I just mentioned essentially are the indicators. That comes from the state. Those are the objectives. On the other hand, something like the evaluation of a digital learning plan, or perhaps the evaluation of a pilot project, where you're going to use whatever comes out of that pilot project to decide how you move on and to what extent you move on, then the kind of reporting and analysis that comes out of that is going to be more complex than just simply writing something up and saying, yep, we did it, and here's the form that proved that we did. Okay. So this kind of gets us just about to the end here. We've outlined the 3 different steps and talked in depth about them somewhat, and intend to share with you information later on about how you can follow up and do more work in each one of those steps. But we're interested in knowing if you have any questions about evaluation or auditing in general, or anything maybe just on the analysis that we just talked about. And if you do, then you can put those into the chat box. In terms of follow-up, I know that we have people here from a variety of different places. Not everybody is from Massachusetts. If you are in Massachusetts and you are a member of, or you or your district is a member of Massachusetts Computer Using Educators, or MassQ, there is training that MassQ offers in doing this exact work that will work with individual districts around developing indicators and the matching the data collection tools and the analysis framework. And that's something called MassQ Evaluators. You can go to the MassQ site and get information about that. If anybody is going to be at ISTE in Denver in June, I'll be doing a 3-hour workshop on this there. So you could sign up for that right now if you're signing up for ISTE stuff. And that will offer, 3 times longer than what we've done here right now. So that'll offer much more opportunity for doing some hands-on development of tools and pieces. And of course, you can always get a hold of us and ask any follow-up questions or further questions for us after this. And the resources on our website and follow-up webinars should be supportive of this as well. So if there are no further questions, then we have reached the end of our hour here. Like I said, feel free to contact us after the fact, and we can answer any other questions that might occur to you later. I think that when you exit this, you will be deposited at a Google survey, which will ask you, well, it's an evaluation webinar, so there's got to be an evaluation of the evaluation webinar, and it'll just sort of find out how this went for you. So if that's it, thank you very much. Hope to see many of you again on a future session, and good luck with your auditing and evaluation work. All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.